We're going to make the transition now from modern news and trying to understand it to ancient news, to news that was first revealed now some 4,000 years ago. In fact, almost exactly 4,000 years ago, because it is as relevant today as it was relevant to the original audience. I'm going to take you back to the Torah, to Bereshith, to a conversation that took place just prior to 2000 BCE, so just shy of 4,000 years ago. In fact, it may be almost exactly 4,000 years ago, because it was about 10 to 20 years in this process that all of these events played out in the life of Abraham. And we are about 19 years away from the end of the world as we know it. From year 6,000 Yah, and the seminal event in this story of the covenant, its formation, portrays that occurred in year 2000 Yah, 4,000 years in between those two dates. It was in 1967-68 BCE that the covenant was finally affirmed by Abraham, when he demonstrated that he indeed completely and totally trusted and relied upon Yahowah. And he went to Mount Moriah to enact a dress rehearsal, if you will, for Passover, for exactly what Yahusha would do on exactly that same place, exactly that same day, 2,000 years later, in year 4,000 Yah. And so we are right now in the midst of a story that is the story of our lives, of the story of how we come to live with God in heaven, how we are saved by Him, how we can relate to Him. And this is an interesting story, because as we have read through the Torah's account of the first meetings and second meeting and now third meeting with Abraham, what we find is that in the first, God asked Abraham to leave Babylon, to come with him to the promised land, something that Abraham was willing to do, which means that Abraham walked away from the religion and politics of Babylon. Something that God asks us to do, even pleads with us to do, before He returns, which means that we are still, most people are still mired in the religious and political myths of Babylon. It's not the country we're talking about. We're talking about man's religious and political, military and economic institutions, and God wants us to separate ourselves from them. And then God first told Abraham what He was offering him. This was an inheritance that was going to make him immortal, an inheritance that was going to make him perfect, an inheritance that was going to enrich and empower him, an inheritance that was going to cause he and those he inspired, his offspring, become sons and daughters of God, children of God. This is the story of the covenant. And along the way, Yahweh established 5 terms and conditions for participating and delineated 5 benefits for those who agree to them. In the midst of all this, Abraham said, but God, I understand you're offering me an inheritance, but what good is it? I'm nearly 100 years old. I don't have a child. I have no family. Inheritance is no good to me. It's no good to my offspring because I don't have any. And so God raised his sights. He took him to heaven. He showed him the light of the stars so that he would understand that what He's really offering us is that we are transitioned from being physical and mortal to energy and immortal, to a spiritual being. And He showed him what it would be like to live as a spiritual being in his home. And when he did, Abraham finally understood, okay, that is what you're offering. That's the benefit of the covenant. The inheritance of the covenant is that we become like light, that we become immortal, that we become brilliant, that we become perfect, that we're able to travel vast distances, we become infinitely empowered over where we are currently. So yeah, I want that. And then the next statement was, even though I trust and rely on you, you're obviously God, otherwise you couldn't have taken me to this place. We couldn't have exposed me to the light of these stars and survived it. Bless you, God. I get it. I'm willing to trust and rely on you, but could you give me some evidence that I could really rely on, that I know for certain this is going to happen, that I'm going to inherit these things? And so that is when God provided, set the scene for this great feast. And the feast was established because the means that the covenant children have to be assured that we are receiving all the benefits of the covenant are in the Moed Mikre, which are Chag, their festival feasts. These invitations to be called out and meet with God, which is what Mikre means, based upon the Hebrew tomb Kara, to invite, to summon, to welcome, to meet, to call out, to read and recite. It is these 7 annual meetings whereby in the first 4 of them God honors each of the promises of the covenant, which is why Yahowah, the diminished corporeal manifestation of Yahweh, fulfilled the first 4 in year 4000 Yah, in the 4th millennia of human history, which collectively bring us from our world to God's home, which is Sukkah, which is the destination, camping out with God. So he established this feast and told us that's the way, and then he provided symbols that showed how we grow with God, how we are nurtured by him, how we are protected by him, how we are empowered by him, how we are saved by him in the role of the Passover lamb, how we are led by the shepherd, and how all of this relates to the Torah, which is the Torah, as brought to us by the set-apart Spirit. That's what God presented. Now, when this all began to happen, what we find is that Hasatan, the adversary, and his fellow demons were not pleased, because in so doing, God was resolving the conflict between he and his creation. This was the way back home. This was the answer. This would restore the conditions that were experienced in the Garden of Eden. And so it reads, and when birds of prey descended upon the lifeless corpses, and he, Abraham, blew at them. And I think in the program yesterday I suggested that the only way to have any effect at these demonic influences was for Yahowah to be he and blowing at them. I don't think that was the case. I'm going to admit that I think it was wrong, and that it is Abraham is the he. It's the most logical conclusion here, that blew at them. You see, the birds of prey, these ayats, vultures, scavengers that feed on death, is Satan and his minions. Satan is Allah. The most obvious, adroit religion honoring Satan, serving Satan interests is Islam. It's the most obvious. It is wholly satanic. Allah is cast into the personality and role and character of Satan. Allah is Satan. And so he's a merchant of death, which is why Islam is so focused on death. And death is really the goal for Satan. Man was created mortal, and without man taking advantage of what God's offering, we die. We just simply cease to exist. And so that is what these birds of prey, symbols for the scavengers that feed on death, that descended, came from a higher place to a lower one, upon the lifelessness that was around. And in this word, feeding upon the lifeless corpses, what we have is whether or not it is pager, which means the birds of prey descended upon the lifeless corpses, or pagas, which means they descended upon the meeting to approach. Same word in Hebrew, PGR. Depends on how it's pointed. The symbolism is, of course, vastly more powerful when you have birds of prey, scavengers that feed on death, descending upon the meeting to approach. Pagas. Because what is this meeting, this festival feast that Yahowah was throwing on behalf of the relationship? it's symbolic of all of the meetings to approach, the 7 mikre. The demonic influences wanted to cause Abraham to ignore what God was offering, because if he did, the covenant wouldn't do him any good. And so Abram, rather than accepting them, blew at them. Nashab eth Abram. Abram tried to forcefully exhale his breath at them. You see, the imagery here is really interesting. Breath in Hebrew is nephesh. That's why this is nashab, written very similarly. Nephesh is that which is inside that is breathed out. It is the sign of consciousness of life. If if a person dies, typically they'll put a finger under their nose or in front of their mouth to see if they're still breathing. Hold a mirror or something to see if they're still breathing under their nose. When you stop breathing, it's a sign that your consciousness is no more, that your soul has departed, that you are dead. And so rather than breathing this in, rather than taking it into himself, Abraham was saying, no, I don't want to breathe you in. I don't want you inside of me. I don't want you influencing me. I'm taking my consciousness, my ability to observe and respond to what I'm witnessing, and I'm throwing it at you. I'm casting it at you. He was trying to keep the vultures, those who feed it upon death, at bay. Trying to keep them outside of him, not breathing them in. But they were not finished. There's a story regarding the covenant that's going to take place 2 generations hence. That my translation of that story is similar to my interpretation of what's going to occur here. And that's the story of Jacob when he becomes Yisrael. And there is this struggle that Jacob has before Yahowah that seems to involve the adversary, the son, and represented by the son, and it's exactly the same fight that is manifest now before us. So as I was saying, there's this transition that is so interesting. It's when Jacob became Yisrael. Yahowah renamed Jacob Yisrael. He became the father of the 12 tribes. He became synonymous with Yisrael, the chosen people. He was the one through whom Yahowah says that he was going to affirm his covenant. And yet what we find is in that transition from being Jacob to Yisrael, and this is Abraham's grandson, because Abraham will go on to father a child. His name will be Yishak, which means laughter. Yishak's son, the one that inherited the covenant, was Jacob. And Jacob means to supplant one's heel, which means that you're walking steadfastly. You're not easily swayed to go astray. You dig in your heels. You're steadfast. You're dependable. That's what Jacob means. And he became Yisrael, which means Ish, individual. Sarah, which is who exists and endures, who engages with El, Yah, God. And that transition between the two is a battle, a wrestling match, if you will. And it's apparent that the wrestling match is with Hasatan. And so Jacob prevails and says, I'm not going to have anything to do with him. He's tempted me. I'm chosen not to avail myself of his temptations, and I'm going to side with Yahowah and embrace the covenant. Well, it appears that this now is a similar story with Abraham, as you would naturally think it should be. The same exists, by the way, with Yahushua, where before he began his public ministry, he had 40 days and 40 nights where he was tempted by Hasatan in the wilderness. And, Hasatan provided his temptations and offered Yahusha this, that, and the other thing. And Yahusha said, no, I'm going to side with the Word of God. Well, so what follows next, and this should be seen as Satan's attempt to lure Abraham away. And that's the way it ought to be. You see, if the covenant were simply a matter of God saying, if you embrace these 5 terms and conditions, I'm going to make you immortal. I'm going to make you perfect. I'm going to adopt you into my family so that you are my heirs. I'm going to enrich you. I am going to empower you. And if it was God himself constantly telling each of us individually, that is what I'm offering you, there would be no one that wouldn't choose that, right? And if there would be no one that wouldn't choose that, then was there really any choice at all? And if there's no choice, how is there free will? And if there's no free will, how is there love? So it all falls apart unless there is an opposing advocate, somebody who is advocating the opposite. That's why Hasatan was allowed to slither into the garden and to propose an alternative point of view. That's why he was allowed here. This is the point. Abraham says, I want the assurance. I want to know for certain how I can rely upon the idea that you're going to offer me all of these things. And it was at that moment that Yahweh revealed the plan, and it is appropriate that Satan be allowed in, so that the choice can be genuine, so that there really is a choice. And when the birds of prey descended upon the lifeless corpses, and when the birds of prey descended upon the meeting to approach, Abram blew at them. The concept here might seem trivial to you. What good does it do to blow at a spiritual being? But it isn't when you understand the nature of the nefesh. It isn't when you understand the nature of a nesalma. The nefesh is our soul. It is equivalent to breath. It is the part of animals that enables animals to observe and respond to the environment, what they're seeing. Abraham was witnessing the means to be assured that we inherit all that God has promised. And the means that he had to observe it and respond to it is his individual nefesh, soul, or consciousness. And he used his nesalma, which is his conscience, his ability to exercise good judgment, to make this decision. And so he's wielding these things at the demonic influences. Makes perfect sense. He wasn't trying to blow them away, but by the very concept of associating this neshab with the breath that was being wielded, we have this association with soul, consciousness, observation, and response. One of the reasons that I shared with you that I think there's commonality between this wrestling match between Abraham and the satanic influences, just as there was between Jacob, his grandson, and the satanic influences before Abraham and Jacob received the full benefits of the covenant, is that first it's wholly logical, wholly rational. It's the way it has to be, really, for the covenant to be a choice. But also because Shemesh, the sun, a setting, was instrumental in the arrival of those who were descending. You see, here the next line says, and it came to be, it came to exist, why Haya, that the sun, Ha-Shemesh, was going, Bo. And so as it says, just as it said that the birds of prey, these vultures, these scavengers, descended, well, the next line says, and the sun descended. But throughout the Torah, prophets, and Psalms, the sun is used as the guise of Satan. Satan wants to be considered as the greater light. He wants to be considered as greater than God. In almost all religions, including Christianity, it's the sun that is worshipped as God. You look at Roman Catholicism. What do you think the halos are? They're symbols of the sun. What do you think the sunbursts are that permeate the religion? When Constantine created the Roman Catholic Church, he looked up upon his God, which was the sun, and he saw the sign of the cross, which is a solar symbol that speaks of when the sun crosses the constellation of Taurus the Bull during the spring equinox when you celebrate Easter Sunday. That he looked up into the sun, and it was the sun that spoke to him as his God and said, under this sign conquer. Christianity is based upon the sun god religion of Babylon, of Egypt, of Assyria, Rome. And so it is the sun that represents the primary guise of Satan. In almost every religion, it is the sun that forms the principal deity. In Islam, it happens to be the moon, but most often it's the sun. And at the time this was written, the sun almost universally represented God. When you spoke of the setting sun to, or even a rising sun, to someone who had come from Babylon, that was their God. That was the symbol of God. That was the guise of God. Well, the same depiction exists here, and it exists in the story of how Yaakov became Yisrael. And it came to exist, the sun was going. And a deep sleep, an induced state of unconsciousness fell upon Abraham. You see, Abraham was here. He was trying to expel his nasama, his consciousness. He was blowing. He says, my sense of observation and responding, I'm using everything I've got within me to keep these demonic spirits from entering me, from influencing me. Then you do that, and what happens to you? In fact, I don't recommend doing it. As children, we've probably all done it. But if you just constantly blow out, guess what happens to you? You go into an induced state of unconsciousness. That's what happens. That's what this word means. Tardema. And behold, a great, dreaded, and terrorizing darkness fell upon him. Darkness is the opposite of Yahowah. Yahowah is light. He equates himself to light. Where there is darkness, there is no light. Light is not the opposite of darkness. Darkness is the lack of light. Where there is light, there is no darkness. Where there is darkness, there is no light. Yahowah is light. What fell upon him was darkness, represented by the absence of Yahowah. This darkness was categorized as being dreaded and terrorizing, terror-ridden, distressful, horrible. The word Emma also means idolatrous, pagan. That dreaded and terrorizing darkness is Hasatan. That's what he represents. It's where he wants everyone to follow him. But it was not to be. Not for Abram. Not for Yaakov. Both chose the light. And when they did, and then he, Yahowah, affirmed to approach and to be near Abraham, and said, you must know with absolute certainty. This is a combination of the same Hebrew word juxtaposed, yada yada. We'll consider that in a moment. And then he said, he affirmed, this is Yahowah, to approach and be near Abraham. you must know with absolute certainty. It is extremely important that you are keenly aware, fully comprehend, and absolutely acknowledge that indeed, as a foreigner, living and traveling as a temporary inhabitant, your seed will exist in the land which is not for them, and they will serve them. And they will respond and seek resolution accordingly in 400 years. Whoa, where in the world did that come from? What's this about being a foreigner? I thought we just sat down to have a nice meal. What's this about 400 years? I'm 100 years old. I'm not going to hang around for another 400. What's this about being a foreigner? I thought you took me to this land. You know, I was a native of Babylon. You took me here. You don't need to rub it in that I'm a foreigner. What does this have to do with the darkness that descended, that was dreaded and terrorizing, and the form of Satan manifested as the setting sun? What did any of that have to do with what was happening? But it had everything to do with it. He had come from Babylon. He knew Babylon. He knew that the sun represented the false god of Babylon, and how all the pagan deities were interacting with the sun as Lord. He knew that. He knew that they had their religion where the son of the sun was born, died a violent death, and was resurrected, just as it occurs in Christianity. He knew all of that. He had a pretty keen understanding, too, that Egypt was based on the same mythology. In fact, Glenn, when he called the program earlier today, spoke about that. He was aware of all of that. And indeed, what Egypt represented is what Yahowah freed his children from. Just as Abraham had chosen not to embrace what Satan represented, Yahowah himself would intervene during the Exodus. That after 400 years of slavery, he would free his children from Mitzrayim, which is the crucible of human oppression, religious, political, military, and economic oppression. Freeing his people, liberating them to live with him. And just as there was satanic influence and creating this blend of religion and politics that was so much at play in Babylon, so would it be in Egypt. Was the same influence. In fact, the religions were almost identical. Both places, the kings claimed to be descendants of the gods. In both places, the sun was the primary deity. The same place, politics and religion were used as a singular tool. They were inseparable. And so God is saying that, yep, just as you, as my child, a child of the covenant, have been led away from this because you left Babylon, we're going to do this again with the descendants of the covenant, with the children of Israel, when I free them from the crucible that is Egypt. You know, it's interesting, too, that while Yahowah uses Mitzrayim to describe Egypt, Egypt is a Greek word, so it's not what the Egyptians called themselves. They called themselves the Black Land. The reference was to the black soil that was left behind when the Nile flooded. But here we have this dreaded and terrorizing darkness, and it was the Black Land, as they referred to themselves after 400 years of being enslaved, of being terrorized by their dreaded taskmasters, that Yahowah came to them, introduced himself by name, and freed them. That's the purpose of the Torah. The purpose of the Torah is to free us from religion. It's to free us from nationalism and politics, economic schemes and military schemes. And so he's telling you, yeah, this party that I showed you, this festival feast, but we're going to have 7 of them. And the purpose of those festival feasts is explicitly to free you and to free your descendants from the crucible of human oppression, from religion and politics. And it is that those very same invitations to meet with God, those same festival feasts would be played out in human history, with Passover taking place as the last event of the tyranny of the Egyptians. And the day that they were free from the corruption of the Egyptians was Matzah, when we were freed from our sins. So that on Bikurim, the following day, the children of Yisrael became the children of God, as their name implies. And then 7 Shabbats later, on the promise of the Sabbath, on Mount Horeb, in what is today Western Arabia, they were given the Torah, enriching and empowering them as it reaches and empowers us. That is the story that is being told. That's why Yahowah answered in this way. Now, this statement did not do Abraham any good. To tell Abraham that 400 years after your seed is in captivity in Mitzrayim, in a land that is not their own, that I am going to liberate them, doesn't do Abraham any good. That's a prophecy of something that's going to happen in the future. So we were told this information because it does us a lot of good. And that's the entire reason for all of this, is because he was speaking through him to us. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to the last segment of Shattering Myths for today. When we listen to Yahowah's response, there is so much we can learn. The first is we have to recognize that this response didn't do Abraham any good at all. So why did God say it? Why was it recorded? The only logical conclusion is because it does us a tremendous amount of good. We can use the fact that in reality, the descendants of Abraham, the Israelites, were in Egypt 440 years. Now, this says 400 years, not 440, because for the first 40 years, they were welcomed guests. And for 400 years, they were slaves, which is what this says. That it happened exactly like Yahowah said it was going to happen. And that their enslavement in Egypt, in Mitzrayim, the black land and the crucible of human political and religious oppression, is what Yahowah is ultimately liberating us from. Just as he had asked Abraham to walk away from Babylon, he is leading his people away from Egypt. They represent the same thing. Political, religious, military, and economic oppression. That's why God hates those things. And so we see this connection of now God intervening in our lives to encourage us to walk away from Babylon and to help us walk away from serving man's political and religious, military, and economic institutions, as the children of Israel were doing in Egypt. That's the connection. That's why God so often tells us that he wants us to come out of Babylon, why he spends so much time describing the political and religious nature of Babylon that he hates so much. That's why he constantly introduces himself as the God who led his people away, who saved them from Mitzrayim, the crucible of human and religious and political oppression. That's the purpose of the Torah. That's God's role in his children's lives, is to save us from man and human institutions. That's what he's offering, to liberate us from them. That's the reason why this story is so important, because if you look at the Moed Mikra, of these invitations to meet with God, of which there's 7 each year, not only would Abraham himself provide a dress rehearsal for the first as Passover, at exactly the right spot, at exactly the right time, for exactly the right reason, but it is these meetings, these festival feasts, that Yahowah used to free his children from being servants, from being oppressed, from the dreaded and terrorizing darkness of Egypt. That's where we find the historical context for the first 4 of these Moed Mikre, of these meetings with God. The 4 that provided the benefits of the covenant. There are 4 that are emblazoned into that story. Passover, where the firstborn sons were spared of those who had the blood of the Passover lamb on the doorway to their homes. Where the bread did not have yeast because they hurriedly left the corruption, the religious and political corruption that was Egypt. And where they celebrated becoming the firstborn children of God on Bokurim. So that on 7 sevens later, on Shavuot, they were enriched and empowered with the Torah. Those 4 events are emblazoned in the story of being freed from Egypt, which is what God is trying to say. If you want assurance that you're going to be my child, that you get to live with me in heaven, that you are empowered like light, that's where to look. Look at my remedy for my children. Pesach, Matzah, Bokurim, Shavuot. Equate this feast that I had arranged for you with those festival feasts. And while there's 7 of them, and ultimately they lead to my home, it's those 4 which provide your assurance. It's those 4 which I have enabled and fulfilled and honored in history. And you're 4,000 yah, exactly when I said I was going to do so. The last 3, of course, are Teruah, where those of us who have benefited from the first 4 announce this message, where we do what we're doing on this program. Reconciliations, where the covenant is ultimately reconciled with Yisrael and with Yahudah, and reaffirmed by embracing and the incorporation of the Torah, which leads us all to camping out with God for all eternity, which is why Sukkah means to camp out, and why there is an 8th day representing eternity. That is the story that Yahowah is telling us through Abraham. It is profound. Are you willing to listen to him? We'll be back with you at this same time tomorrow. May Yah bless.